What if I told you that the most devastating betrayal in tag team wrestling history didn't come from a rival, didn't come from a bitter enemy, didn't come from someone who had been plotting in the shadows for months? It came from a brother? Not just any brother. A twin. A man who shared the same blood, the same face, the same heartbeat. A man who stood side by side through wars, through championships, through family drama that shook the entire wrestling world to its core. And yet, when the moment came when the lights were brightest and the stakes were highest, Jey Uso looked his own flesh and blood in the eyes, and chose chaos. Welcome back to Wrestling Impact. I'm your host, and today we are diving deep into one of the most emotionally charged, most shocking, most gut-wrenching storylines in recent wrestling memory. The day Jey Uso betrayed Jey Uso after losing the tag team titles. Buckle up, because this story has layers. This story has heartbreak. This story has the kind of drama that reminds you why professional wrestling isn't just a sport, it's a human experience wrapped in spandex and stadium lights. Let's go. To truly understand what happened on that catastrophic night, you have to go back. You have to understand who the Usos are, not just as a tag team, but as people. Jey and Jey Uso didn't just become one of the greatest tag teams in wrestling history overnight. They bled for it. They sacrificed for it. They came up together, trained together, failed together, and rose together. For years, the Usos were synonymous with tag team excellence. Multiple title reigns, show-stealing matches, a natural chemistry in the ring that only twins could possess. When one moved left, the other moved right. When one was in trouble, the other was already climbing the turnbuckle. They were as close to telepathic as wrestling gets. But somewhere along the way, cracks began to form. Not visible at first. The kind of cracks that appear underneath the surface, invisible until the pressure builds so high that everything just shatters. The tension had been brewing for weeks before that fateful night. If you were watching closely, and I mean really watching, reading between the lines, studying the body language, you could see it. Jey had been carrying something. A frustration. A resentment. Maybe it was the feeling that Jey was getting more of the spotlight. Maybe it was the fact that Jey had started to build his own identity, his own crowd connection, his own legacy outside of the tag team unit. Main event Jey Uso was no longer just one half of a duo. He was becoming something unto himself. And Jey? Jey was watching that happen from the sideline, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a storm was gathering. On the night in question, the Usos walked into that arena as tag team champions. The gold was around their waists. The crowd was electric. The energy was the kind you feel in your chest before a match even starts. Their opponents were hungry, dangerous, and motivated, a team that had been chasing those belts for weeks, a team that had done their homework and was ready to give everything they had to take those titles home. The match that followed was nothing short of a masterpiece. For the first 15 minutes, the Usos were firing on all cylinders. The synchronized double-team moves, the super kicks that landed like thunderclaps, the hip tosses that drew gasps from the crowd. The challengers were tough, though. Every time the Usos had the momentum, their opponents found a way to counter. A blind tag here. A desperate roll-up there. The near falls were coming fast and the crowd was losing their minds. Then came the moment that changed everything. Jey Uso was legal in the ring, fighting off both challengers simultaneously, running on pure adrenaline and crowd energy. The fans were chanting his name. He was moments away from making the tag to Jey, who was on the apron with his arm outstretched, waiting. And in that split second, that one fraction of a moment where everything hung in the balance, Jey reached out for the tag. His fingertips were inches from Jey's hand. And Jey pulled back. Just slightly. Just enough. Just far enough that the tag never happened. Jey didn't notice immediately. He turned back into the action, trying to fight his way out, but the momentum had shifted. The challengers capitalized. A brutal combination of moves left Jey Uso flat on the mat, and the referee's hand came down. 1, 2, 3. New tag team champions. The arena went absolutely silent for a half-second, that collective gasp of disbelief before the noise crashes back in. New music hit. New champions celebrated. And the USO era as tag team champions was over. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. As the new champions celebrated at ringside, Jey Uso slowly pulled himself back to his feet inside the ring. Exhausted. Devastated. He looked over at Jey, and for a moment, just a moment, his eyes said everything. That was the look of a man searching for comfort from his brother after a crushing defeat. That was the look of someone reaching out for the one person who was supposed to always be there. What he got instead changed everything. Jimmy Uso stepped through the ropes and walked toward his brother. The crowd was still buzzing, still processing what they'd just witnessed. And then Jimmy opened his mouth and said words that cut through the arena like a knife. Not loud enough for most to hear clearly at first, but clear enough for Jey. Clear enough for the cameras that caught every syllable. This is your fault. Every single time, Jey. Every single time, it's your fault. Jey's face changed. The exhaustion gave way to confusion. Then confusion gave way to hurt. And then when Jimmy stepped closer and shoved him, hurt gave way to something raw and real and painful that no one in that building was prepared for. The crowd erupted. Not in excitement, in shock. In genuine disbelief. Because what they were watching wasn't a wrestling angle in that moment. It was two brothers. It was family. And family was falling apart in real time in front of thousands of people. Jey tried to talk to Jimmy. You could see it. Tried to reach out, tried to understand what was happening. But Jimmy wasn't interested in talking. He had months of bottled frustration, months of feeling like he was playing second fiddle, months of watching his brother become the fan favorite, the babyface, the solo star, and it had all come pouring out in the most destructive way possible. Jimmy Uso was done being the other one, done being the background. And he was going to make sure Jey and everyone else knew it. The backstage reaction was immediate. Locker rooms were buzzing. People who had known the Uso brothers for years were standing around monitors watching the replay with their hands over their mouths. Veterans who had seen every kind of wrestling drama imaginable were shaking their heads. Because there's betrayal and then there's this. This was personal in a way that transcended the scripted world of professional wrestling. This had weight. This had history. This had Samoa Joe blood running through it. The fan reaction was equally seismic. Social media exploded within seconds. Clips were being shared, moments were being replayed. People who had grown up watching the Usos were genuinely devastated. Comments flooded in from fans saying they never expected this, that they'd seen betrayals before, but not like this. Not Jimmy. Not to Jey. The Uso brotherhood had always felt unbreakable. Even when things were complicated, even when the family dynamics and their storylines got messy, there was always this sense that at the end of the day, they were Usos. They were family. They were forever. That word forever had become a rallying cry for their fanbase. And now that word felt hollow. Now that word was a wound. In the days that followed, the wrestling world watched closely as the narrative developed. Jimmy Uso was no longer hiding his feelings. In interviews, in backstage segments, in confrontations, he was raw and unapologetic. He talked about how he'd carried Jey. How he'd made sacrifices no one ever acknowledged. How every time the Usos got close to the mountaintop, Jey always found a way to be the center of attention and Jimmy always found a way to be overlooked. Was it fair? Objectively, probably not entirely. But was it real emotionally, psychologically real to Jimmy? Absolutely. That's what made it so compelling. This wasn't a villain who was evil for the sake of being evil. This was a man in pain. A man who felt invisible standing next to his own reflection. And Jey Uso? Jey had to process all of this in public. Had to walk out to that crowd every week knowing his brother had just blown up everything they'd built together. And yet, and this is what separates great wrestling from good wrestling, Jey didn't collapse. Jey Uso took that pain and he wore it like armor. Every time he walked through that curtain, the crowd felt it. They knew what he was carrying. And they carried it with him. The chants. The energy. The hands in the air when his music hit. Main event Jey Uso had been growing as a solo star before the betrayal. After it, he became something else entirely. He became a symbol. Because sometimes in professional wrestling, just like in real life, the worst thing that happens to you becomes the defining thing about you. Not in a tragic way. In a triumphant way. The betrayal that was supposed to break Jey Uso became the fuel that lit him on fire. Every super kick landed harder. Every dive to the outside hit with more desperation. Every time he kicked out of a near fall, the crowd was on their feet because they knew this man had something to prove not just to the wrestling world, but to his brother. The road to a potential confrontation between Jimmy and Jey has been one of the most emotionally charged journeys in recent wrestling history. And what makes it so irresistible is that there's no clean answer here. Who's right and who's wrong? You can make a case both ways. Jimmy's grievances, while expressed in the worst possible manner, didn't come from nowhere. And Jey's hurt, while completely justified, is going to have to be faced head-on if either of these men is going to move forward. That's the beauty of great wrestling storytelling. It doesn't always give you a hero and a villain. Sometimes it gives you two people who are both right and both wrong at the same time, and it puts them on a collision course and dares you to pick a side. And when that collision finally happens, when Jimmy and Jey Uso stand across the ring from each other, not as tag team partners, not as champions, but as brothers with unfinished business and a lifetime of shared history, it is going to be one of the most emotionally devastating matches you have ever seen. Because every super kick will mean something more than just a wrestling move. Every pin attempt will be loaded with years of brotherhood and betrayal. And when it's over, regardless of who gets their hand raised, nothing will ever be the same for either of them. That's the story. That's the heartbreak. That's the brilliance of the Jimmy Uso betrayal. It took two of the most beloved tag team wrestlers in the world and turned their greatest strength, each other, into their greatest source of pain. And it reminded every single one of us watching why we fell in love with professional wrestling in the first place. Because at its best, this art form tells stories that hit you somewhere deep. Stories about pride and jealousy and love and loss, and the terrifying reality that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones most capable of hurting you. If you made it this far, you already know this is just the beginning. The USO saga has chapters yet to be written, and Wrestling Impact is going to be right here for every single one of them, breaking it all down, giving you the analysis, the emotion, and the perspective you deserve. If this video hit you the way it hit me while writing it, drop a like, because it genuinely helps more people find this channel and join this community we are building together right here. Leave a comment below. I want to know, are you Team Jimmy or Team G? And why? Let's have that conversation, because this fan base has opinions and I want to hear all of them. Subscribe to Wrestling Impact if you haven't already, because we cover the stories that matter, the moments that shake the wrestling world, and we do it with the passion that this sport deserves. The USO story is far from over, and neither are we.